Those are some great scriptures that are helping us launch into our series called Miracles. And I was really debating walking out and, to the song, I Believe in Miracles, by Hot Chocolate, but I didn't think that'd be very appropriate. Yes, their name is Hot Chocolate, if you didn't know the group that sang that, right? I didn't think that'd be very appropriate, so I thought these scriptures would be a little bit better way to start this off, but I'm very excited. My heart is burdened as we lead into Easter to kick off this series and talk about the power of God and what He can do in our life and in our world. And I think it's sometimes can be one of the things that we underplay in the life of the church is that God is active and He's moving and He's working, and He has always been active and moving and working. And how much so would He want to be active and moving and working in our lives? And so I'm excited as we jump into this series, and I got to thinking this week about, the phrases that either your parents used on you or you've used on your kids that don't work. The phrases that, everybody uses, but they're just kind of worthless phrases, the phrases that are like, hey, make sure that you actually eat all your dinner before dessert. Like, who's going to do that, really? Like, you're going to grow up one day and you're really going to do that as an adult? No, like that doesn't happen. Or what about the phrase that you can think about sometimes is like, don't talk to strangers. Telling your kids, don't talk to strangers. My 4-year-old's going through this phase now. Like, we'll go through a drive-through and she's like, Dad, don't talk to strangers. And I'm like, who taught you that? Oh, yeah, we did, right? It's like, that's not what I meant, but do you want your donut or not, right? Like just... And so sometimes we can use these phrases or say these things, and it doesn't actually produce the results that we want. Another one that's really popular is like you tell your teenage kid, if your friends jumped off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff? Right? Why would we ask that? The answer is yes, right? Like as a parent, just don't ask that question because you don't want to know the answer, right? And when we think about that, I was growing up as a teenager, we used to grow up at the lake a lot, and we spent a lot of weekends at the lake, and it was not like Lake Conroe, okay? You could see your toes in the water. It's like 200 feet deep. There's bluffs. There's no alligators, all right? So I don't know what this stuff is out here, but that ain't a little lake, okay? And I remember growing up, and we would pull up to this like cove, and there'd be a bluff, and you could jump off the cliff into the water. And so I remember you'd be standing around with a bunch of your buddies, and you're like, I can jump that one. I bet I can go higher. You know how it goes, just teenage boy life. And it's one thing to say on the bottom of the cliff that you jump off it, but somehow, when you get to the top, by the time you get to the top, it's altogether a different jump, And I remember doing this over and over, and sometimes what happened is you would begin to go to the top of the cliff, and your confidence begins to shrink the more you get to the top. Your unbelief starts to set in of I'm not really sure I can do this, or maybe fear rings out louder and louder in your head you're going to die, right? And so I just remember all these feelings and things that would come up, but the thing that would always help me jump off the cliff was actually that phrase. If your friends are going to jump off, would you do it too? You bet, if they make it out alive, right? That's the thing. You would watch the first guy go off, and I'd be like, well, he didn't die, so I'm surely we're going to be okay. And the thing about jumping off a cliff into the lake is you have no idea what's beneath the water. None. What were we thinking? What were my parents thinking, for crying out loud? But there's something about jumping off the cliff that kind of reminds me a little bit of what it takes in faith sometimes. As we talk about miracles, I think oftentimes the things that hold us back at the top of the cliff are unbelief. Unbelief. I don't know if I can do this. Maybe for you started out in your faith journey, you thought, I got this, we can do this, I feel confident, I feel strong in my faith, and I'm going to do this. But somewhere over the years, it's like climbing to the top of the cliff. The higher you got, the longer you went, the more you felt like unbelief set in. Sometimes it's when you get to the top, you feel like the fear has set in of, what are people going to think? If I'm one of those Christian people and I say I believe God can do miracles and we talk about this at church, that's one thing, but living it out on Monday morning when I go to work, that's altogether something different. And sometimes fear about what other people might think, or fear about what happens if the miracle can happen for everybody in the Bible, but not for me. And we begin to feel these things creep up in our life as we begin to talk about and think about miracles. The other thing is sometimes we have bad experiences, right? It's that feeling when you get to the top of the cliff and you remember that one time your buddy jumped off and hit a tree or something, or like the one time your buddy jumped off and did a belly flop and it hurt worse than you thought it would, or like there are those moments where some bad experience is playing out over in your mind. And when we talk about miracles, often what can happen is we instantly think of that crazy YouTube video, right? The one of somebody doing crazy stuff. Did you know there are some bad actors in life? But you don't stop going to the movies, do you? Right? Like, you've watched a Hallmark movie, let's be honest, right? Did you stop watching movies? No, like maybe Hallmark movies, but, right? It's like, I'm not ratting on y'all. I'll watch a Hallmark movie every once in a while, just be honest. I had to be honest, my wife was watching, okay? But sometimes there are some bad actors in life, and sometimes maybe you've experienced something along the way that was harmful to your faith. Maybe somebody said something over you, or maybe you experienced a church background or experience, and it wasn't your cup of tea, and so often what can happen is people will write off the miraculous of God just because of what some man has done. And that can be a challenge too. Often I think the most challenge that we can face when it comes to miracles is just the sense in our heart of, do we actually believe that God can do what he said he can do? In my heart of hearts, I sing here and I worship here and I know here and I believe here. But when I walk out those doors, do I believe that the God of the universe cares enough about my life to work and move? Do I believe that his word is truer than anything I've ever seen in my life? So much so that I'm going to stand on his word regardless of what I'm seeing and regardless of what I'm experiencing in my life. And as we jump into this series about miracles, my burden, my heart is this, that we would see and experience all that God has designed for us to see and experience. That we would walk in the life that God has for us, not based off of bad experiences and not based off what other people have said and not based off our fears or our unbelief, but that we would lean into the things of God. Because what I found is the same things that kept a teenage boy from wanting to jump off the cliff can often be the same things that cause us to draw back when we start talking about the miraculous things of God, the supernatural power of God. Listen to what it says in Psalm 86, verse 10. It's a declaration. It says, "For you are great, God, and you do wondrous things. You alone are God." The burden behind this whole series, before we jump into the miracles of Jesus over the next couple of weeks, the burden behind this entire series is based in the reality and the fact that God does wondrous things. And if he's always been doing wondrous things and he can do wondrous things today, my question on the table for us in this series is, what wondrous things does God want to do in your life in the days ahead? What incredible, supernatural, miraculous things would God want to do to move and work in your life? But often we have to overcome the objections. We have to overcome the things that would hold us back from jumping off of this cliff of faith. John chapter 12, verse 36 gives us some insight. When Jesus had said these things, he departed and he hid himself from them. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him. Nevertheless, even many of the authorities believed in Jesus, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. This to me is an eye-opening passage that Jesus hid. Like Jesus hid from other people based off of their unbelief and their fear of him continuing to move and work in their life. My greatest concern would be that as a church, we would miss out on the things that God wants to do. I would never want God to hide from us. I would never want his miraculous, supernatural working power to hide from my life because of my unbelief, or because I was afraid of what other people might think, or because I wasn't really sure how this was all supposed to work out. as I think about that, there's a man in the Bible, and just this morning, before we jump into the series, I'm going to share his life with you just a little bit. His name is Job. It's not Job, but in your Bible, there's a book called J-O-B. His name is Job. And Job found that in his life, he went through some stuff, y'all. He experienced some things. He experienced some loss. He experienced some great loss. He lost his family. He lost everything that he had. He had friends around him who challenged him and questioned him and told him bad answers. And if you've ever had friends in your life that gave you bad advice, you're not alone. And Job finds himself in this situation. And I want to point out his life to you this morning, because by the end of the story of Job, we turn in Job 42. And in Job 42, he begins to make his final proclamation, his final assessment on his life, and saying, man, I've been through some stuff. I've been through the ringer, but here's what I want you to know. And Job 42, verses 2 and 5, here's kind of a summary of it. It says, stop and consider the wonders of God. Oh, stop right there, because the word said stop, so let's stop. Sometimes I wonder if I miss out on the miracles of God because I'm not willing to stop. Stop and consider the wonders of God. In other words, what I want in this series is I want us to come to a place where, regardless of the fact that we live in 2024 and everybody's driving 95 miles on the interstate and everybody's waiting less than 12 hours for their Amazon package to show up on the front door, and regardless of the fact that our calendars have more things crammed into, like when I see my calendar on a Monday morning and there's an event on the calendar and there's another event on top of that event and another, I'm like, man, my life's a little bit messed up sometimes. We live in a fast-paced, moving world, and what Job is saying, sometimes you just got to stop. And you got to begin to consider the wonders of God. Listen to what he says. He says, I know that God can do all things. I know that God can do all things. In other words, regardless of what he had experienced, regardless of the bad actors in his life, and regardless of the stuff that had happened to him, he made an acknowledgement even yet still to say, I know that God can do all things. You know, the miraculous starts when we start right there. Like you're wondering, how do I begin to see God's moving and working power in my life? I'm not waiting on a lightning bolt. I'm waiting for my heart to come to a place where I can acknowledge that God can do anything. Not just anything, God can do all things. And when we have that acknowledgement over our life, maybe for you that becomes a declaration of faith around your house. Maybe when you find yourself up next to a problem. Have you ever got in the car with your spouse and talked the problem all the way to dinner, right? And you're like, you thought you would feel better, but now you just feel worse, right? I've never talked to the problem and been like, man, my life's so much better now. I got that all worked out. I just let it all out and vented it all out. It's like there's nothing in the Bible that says you should vent, right? And so I get going and I realize I'm just talking my problems. And what if in the middle of our problems, we started speaking something else? Hey, Lord, my finances are really in a challenge and a pickle right now, and I just really need help. I know you can do all things. Hey, God, my family is going through a lot right now. I'm not really sure how to get us out of it, but I know that you can do all things. Hey, God, my workplace is a mess right now. I'm not even sure if my boss likes me, and I'm not even sure if I'm going to be able to keep my job, but I know that you can do all things. And we begin to speak what God wants us to have in our heart. And the miraculous starts at a place when we understand and acknowledge that we can't do our life without him. When we talk at church about salvation, we're talking about a moment in time where people say yes to Jesus. They realize they can't do it on their own. When we said yes to Jesus, maybe you got on your knees. Maybe it was at a church camp as a kid or in your granny's church, or maybe you came back to church and you said yes to Jesus here. When you made that acknowledgement to say yes to Jesus, what you're saying is, I can't do life on my own. God, I'm going to need your help. And a miracle happened. You're like, well, miracles have never happened in my life. Well, if you've been saved, yes, they have. A miracle happened. The moment you said yes to Jesus, your eternity in heaven was secure. Your past was forgiven. You're a completely new creation in Christ because you said yes to him. A miracle happened on the spot. You know when it happened? It happened when you acknowledged that God can do what you can't. It happened in your life when you acknowledged that you need the power of someone greater than yourself. And that's the place where miracles give birth. That's a place where you can put a seed in the ground and say, I want to see the miracles of God growing in my life. It starts with, like Job, saying, God, I know that you can do all things. Listen to what Job said. Job said, I had heard of my God by the hearing of my ear, but now my eyes see you. I think that's a powerful phrase. I had heard of God by the hearing of my ear. It's like Chris was talking about last week. He did a fantastic job. Sometimes we hear, but we don't hear. Sometimes we can know it up here, but we don't know it down here. Sometimes we can hear someone say it at church, but we don't feel it in our life. Sometimes we can hear it over and over. The pastor can preach it. He can say it as much as he wants, but until our eyes have seen it, there's something that transpires in that moment. There's something that happens that's powerful. And Job, having been through all that he had been through, got to a place where he acknowledged, I've been through a lot. I've been through the ringer. It may not look the way that I thought it would look. Things are not going the way I thought they would go. But I still believe that God can do all things. And I still believe that because I'm seeing his wondrous works in my life, that I'm now seeing on a level that I've never seen before. And I think there is no greater burden for the start of a series than that right there. A God who would come to you today, regardless of your past, regardless of what's happening today. Maybe you need a miracle in a big way today. Maybe you've been waiting on a miracle for quite some time. You're saying, I just need something. Or maybe for you, the days ahead where there'll come a point in time where you're saying, Lord, I really need you to work in this area. Regardless of what playing field you're on today, you have to know this. It all starts with a heart that acknowledges, I need the help of God in my life. The series is only powerful. It's not powerful. You see, sometimes people get it wrong. They think, oh, we're going to start talking about the miracles of Jesus and just talking about the miraculous things that he did. That's the powerful part. No. It's when he moves and works in your life. That's the powerful part. I can stand up here all month long and tell a story of a miracle, but until you experience the miracle, it's not powerful in your own life. Until you embrace it and wrap your arms around it and say, if God did it for them, he can do it for me. If God has always been moving and faithful and working in that way, then I'm going to hold on to that in my own life. But I don't know what that is for you today. So the start of this series actually has nothing to do with what I say today and everything to do with the posture of your heart to say, God, I'm looking for your help in this area of my life. I know I can't do it, but you can. God, my health is beyond doctor's understanding. It's beyond what I know to do anymore. I don't know anything about how I can get better, but I know that you do. And so I'm turning over to you. God, my family is in a disrepair that I might have caused some of this, and some of it may have just happened along the way, but it is in a place and a position where it needs your help more than anything else. And when we get to that place in our life where we can acknowledge and invite God into those areas, can I tell you, that's when the miracles start. That's when you get to a place where you begin to see God move and work. So this morning, I'm going to share with you a story that actually has no miracles in it, because that's a great way to start a series about miracles. I'm going to share with you the story of Jesus praying in the garden hours before his death on the cross. Yes, because it's Holy Week and I'm a pastor and that's what I'm supposed to do, but also because I believe it actually sets the stage for the hardest message we're going to preach in this whole series. Nobody likes to do the hard stuff first, right? It's like when your parents gave you chores, kids, right? You're like, I'm not starting with the hard one. When your boss gives you a project at work, you're like, I'm not starting with, I want the easy stuff. But you know what? Today we're going to start with the hard stuff, because this right here is the crux of where it all ends. And I titled the message today, Waiting on a Miracle. Waiting on a miracle. Seeing the miracle is not the hard part. That's the fun part. Waiting on the miracle. Having the faith and the persistence in your faith and perseverance of your faith to make it to the miracle, that can be altogether a different story. I'm going to share with you the story of Jesus in the garden. It says this in Luke chapter 22, verse 39. It says, and Jesus came out and he went, as was his custom. He regularly went to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, pray that you may not enter into temptation. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and he prayed, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Hours before the cross. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening Jesus. And being in agony, he prayed even more earnestly. And his sweat became like drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he arose from the prayer, he came to the disciples and he found them sleeping. Other gospels tell the same story in a little bit more detail. And basically, Jesus went to them 3 times, and every time they were sleeping. Every time he went back to them, they were sleeping. He says, you have to pray. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. It's a great story of the final hours of Jesus' life. And as we read it, oftentimes people focus on the disciples. A lot of times when you hear this passage preached, you probably heard it preached last Easter or the Easter before. The thing is, most people focus on the disciples sleeping. I don't actually think this passage is as much about the disciples as I do think it is about what Jesus himself was doing. That in the final hours of his life, he made it a priority. He could have been sleeping, resting up. He was about to undergo one of the most physically rigorous, torturing events in all of history. There are a lot of things he could have been doing, but in the moments leading up to the cross, he spent his time praying in the garden. Why? Because I believe there was something that was in that prayer that he needed to see the miracle all the way through. Why are you focusing on prayer, Jesus? You could be sleeping. Why are you focusing on prayer? You could be doing a million other things. I think it's because we learned something from Jesus in this moment. If you don't realize it or not, Jesus himself was waiting on a miracle. I think sometimes we look at Jesus and we hear about the miracles that he did, but we don't think about the miracles that he was experiencing in his own life. You see, because he's about to crawl up onto a cross and be buried in a tomb, dead in the tomb for 3 days, waiting on the greatest miracle the world has ever seen. And in those moments leading up to the miracle that he experienced of being raised from the dead by the power of God, he spent his time praying. I want to talk to you about your waiting season because I think it's the hardest season. I think when you're waiting on a miracle, it can be one of the most challenging things to stay the course, to stay focused, and to continue to believe that God is working things out on your behalf. So sometimes we have to understand that the waiting is not God's punishment to us. Like sometimes I think the first thing we can do when it's not happening the way we want or the way we thought it would or with the timing that we want is we often think that that's God's some weird way of punishing us. That's not the case. If that was the case, then there would be a lot more story to tell here. Listen to what begins to happen. Jesus prayed more earnestly, and sweat became like drops of blood falling down to the ground. In other words, in this moment, he is praying as a way of preparation. He's praying a prayer of preparation for what he's about to do. If you're in a waiting season for a miracle of God or a move of God in your life, can I encourage you to do what Jesus did? If it worked for him, by golly, it's good enough for me. And in that moment, he found it important enough to pray. Why? Because it was preparing the stage for what was about to happen. You know, when I discipline my kids, I'll give them a discipline and they'll wail and they'll, like the world is ending, right? I'm always amazed. I don't laugh, because that'd be cruel to laugh at my kids, but like I'm always amazed that, they're so consumed by the punishment that they fail to see the bigger picture. I mean, come on, they're 2 and 4 years old. They should get it by now, right? Like they're my children from my DNA. I'm always amazed that they're not looking at the bigger picture. What often can happen is when we think the waiting is about our punishment, what does our focus go to? I can tell you this, it doesn't go to preparation. It doesn't go for setting the stage for the right opportunity. It doesn't go to getting our heart. It goes and focuses on what's not working, on what's not happening, on why is it this way. And so often we can be like our kids are. And so if you're waiting on a miracle, I want to challenge you. Maybe the first thing you should do is think about the bigger picture. Think about the bigger picture by praying. Here's what it says in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31. Actually, before we get there, I want to tell you this story. I don't like to wait, okay? Anybody not like to wait? I don't like to wait. So when we were planting the church, we were looking for a location to meet. And we were looking at schools, and elementary school was an option, only you should thank me after service today. Elementary schools have squatty potties, so we weren't, that was not going to be a good thing. And we were looking all around, and we just could not find anything that was 10,000 square feet or more. And we were looking, and one night I was sitting at the table, and I had every realtor app pulled up there is, and I'm just looking and looking. I've already looked 100 times. You've looked for that house. You're like, oh yeah, it's showing me that I've already looked at this house 1,000 times, right? And so it's like, I'm looking. My wife looked over at me in the most sweet, loving way. We have this relationship. She just said, when are you going to stop striving, and when are you just going to pray about it? And I'm like, don't tell me that, when your spouse is right, but you don't want them to be right. And I kid you not, in that moment, she's like, when are you going to stop striving? And I remember sitting there in that very moment, I got a text message from a pastor who used to have a church in this building. Said, hey, I own this church building. It's right behind Magnolia High School. And I'm going to turn it into a community center and lease it as a community center. But would you guys be interested? I hear you're getting ready to start a church. Would you guys be interested in renting it for a place to have church? And I'm like, you bet. Let's go. And he's like, it's right behind Magnolia High School. I'm like, no, it's not. Why? Because I had been driving around the property of Magnolia High School 1,000 times. And I've been praying, right? How many of y'all knew this building was back here till you got back here, right? It's like, right? And I had prayed and prayed. Can I tell you something, though? I didn't do anything to find this building. I didn't work for this building. I didn't find this building. You know who did? The Lord, through divine connection, made this happen. And now we have a home, and now we have a place. Why? Not because of my striving. Thankfully, my wife was a praying wife, right? Husbands, thank your wives for all the things they save you from, okay? But I'm acknowledging this because I want you to know that in our working in those moments, often instead of waiting and praying, we work. And we work in the wrong direction. And so I had this thought, and it comes out of Isaiah chapter 40, but sometimes we get tired waiting. Like, have you ever gotten weary in the waiting? Like just you get tired. Well, I just want to encourage you in a loving way this morning. If you're getting weary in the waiting, maybe you're waiting the wrong way. Because what Jesus intends for us is that when we wait the right way with him, we don't get weary, we get strengthened. What happened with him in the garden? He prayed, and God sent an angel to strengthen Jesus, the Savior of the world, hours before he went up on the cross. What am I saying? I'm saying he was waiting on the miracle to happen, and in the process, what did God do in his prayer time? He strengthened Jesus. He gave him the strength that he would need to do one of the greatest miracles the world has ever seen. And I think about that because I think for me, often when I'm waiting on the miracle that I'm looking for, I get weary and I get tired and I strive and I do it all the wrong ways. Listen to what Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31, you've probably heard this scripture before. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew. I'm going to read that again because that will preach. Those who what? Wait for the Lord. They shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. My question is, are you viewing the waiting season as a preparation season? Coming to a place where you're saying, in my waiting, I'm going to spend time in prayer. Listen, if you need a miracle in your marriage, start praying for your marriage. If you need a miracle in your health, start praying for your health. If you need a miracle in your finances or your whatever it is, don't just talk the problem, start praying it through. Second thing this morning is this: the waiting is not intended to deliver punishment. It's intended to develop persistence in you. Develop persistence. Nobody likes that word. I got a really resounding. You guys were so excited that I said that. Like I could just feel it in the room. Nobody likes that word. Why? Because we got to develop it. Nobody likes that word. Why? Because it takes time. We don't get it right the first time, every time. And it reminds me a little bit like this. Men, don't point out your wives here, okay? But men, if you're ever driving in the car and all of a sudden your wife goes, "Babe!" like starts yelling at the top of her lungs, and you're like, what? Where's the train? It's about to kill us all, like, right? Like that's like, she's like, oh, there's a car out there, and it's like 100 yards away in the Target parking lot, like going 2 miles an hour, right? Am I the only one in this? Okay. No, your wives don't freak out? Okay, all right. And it's in those moments that I'm like I'll think something like this, like, why are you challenging my driving skills? Like, I've kept us alive this far. Like I think I'm gonna be okay. You guys are, I'm gonna turn around. You guys are elbowing your spouses right now. I see that. I don't know anybody's male, okay? And I'm like it's in the moments that we start challenging one another. It's like, I know how to drive. I know how to do this. Sometimes in the waiting, we start challenging God. Sometimes in the waiting, we start asking a lot of questions that maybe we shouldn't be asking. Why? Well, why this way? It's like your 4-year-old. Why? Why this way? Well, why not now? And why not then? And well, what happens when? And we start asking all of these questions. I'm not saying God can't handle your questions. I'm saying the spirit and the heart behind your question is what matters. When Jesus was in the garden praying, he did not question God's will for his life. Often people will read that passage and they misconstrue it. Jesus is not questioning God's will for his life. He's coming to terms emotionally with the fact that the time that God has pre-planned from the beginning of the world was happening right then and right now. And Jesus in agony is in the moment understanding. And listen to what the words are. You heard it when I read it earlier. Luke 22:42. Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. In that moment in prayer, what Jesus is doing, the Savior of the world, might I remind you, and if he needed to do it, then I think maybe I need to do it, is he was aligning his will with God's will. You see, Jesus had been telling people all along, like, hey, the temple, it's going to be torn down and it's going to be rebuilt. And he had been alluding to his death and resurrection for a long time. This wasn't new news to Jesus. Jesus is not in the garden figuring this all out for the first time. No, what Jesus is doing is he's aligning his will, saying, Father, your will be done in my life, no matter what. No matter what it costs me, no matter what it looks like, no matter how long I have to wait. What's happening here? There's a persistence to Jesus' faith. When Jesus came into the world, he knew his mission and he walked it out. And when he got to the garden, he got in prayer, all it did was just shore up the details. All it did was just get his heart in alignment and say, I'm going to continue on the mission that I've been doing this whole time. And that persistence that came out of the garden got us to the cross. But often what happens is in the persistence, we get weary, we get tired, and we're waiting on God and we start asking the wrong questions. Let me give something that I think can help you see the miraculous of God in your life. Not always, but a lot of times, God is slow quick. Not always, but a lot of the time, God is slow quick. What do I mean? I mean that he moves slow by our standards, and then when he moves, it's quick. Like I said, in planting the church, this was about 2014. I remember the service I was sitting in at a church in Dallas, Texas. I remember the word God gave me. I remember what I wrote down. I remember the worship songs that were playing. We knew that we were going to plant a church. Can I tell you, that was almost 10 years ago. And can I tell you, for 10 years, it moved slowly. The preparation, the waiting season, y'all, goes slow. And it moved slowly. And I'll be honest with you, there are times in your life where you would look at God and you say, God, why aren't you hurrying this thing along? Hey, I got a schedule to keep, Lord. Hey, I've been waiting on this a while. But we got to understand, in the perspective of God, eternity is a long time. And if he has an eternal being, he has always been and he always will be, then can I tell you, our timetables are not his. And what happens is when we can understand that God is slow quick, what it does is it helps us grow in our persistence and patience. Patience goes hand in hand with persistence. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 3, for the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It's saying, what God's doing, it's going to hasten to the end. It's going to go quick. But listen to this, it's not going to lie. In other words, his will is going to happen. His plan, he's got it out there. You don't let go of it. But listen to this part. If it seems slow, wait for it. You're like, that's the worst advice ever. People would say, how do you know, you ask when you're young, how do I know when it's the right person to marry? I would get the advice, you'll know when you know. I'm like, that's terrible advice. Of course I'll know when I know, but how do I know that I know? We can play these games with God. But listen to what he says. It will surely come. It will not delay. Persistence in your faith says, regardless of what I'm seeing today, I'm going to believe that it's going to come because he said it. And if he said it, it's going to happen. It doesn't lie. I'm going to believe it because it's in his word. And his word says, I can stand on this. And I'm going to stand on this fact that I can have peace in my family regardless of what it looks like today, because I know it ain't look like peace today. But I'm going to hold on to his word. It doesn't lie. But it doesn't always go as quick as we want it to go. God is slow quick sometimes. When we planted the church, we had the word about 10 years ago. But can I tell you, it was slow for a season, but 8 months ago, it went quick. It's been a quick sprint for 8 months. Why? Because that's just what happens when God starts breathing, things start moving. Things that you've been wrestling with for years can be changed overnight. Things that you thought would take a lot longer, he can then start breathing on and moving along for your life. What do you do in the process? You wait with him. You wait with him. Your faith says, God, I'm going to believe today. That no matter how slow this thing feels for me today, I'm going to believe that you're good. And I'm going to believe what Psalmist says in Psalm 86, that you are good and you do wondrous things. What is he saying? You are good, God, and you do good things. I'm going to hold on to that word even when it feels slow. What happened to Jesus in the garden was Jesus had a restored sense of purpose when he walked out of the garden. He said in the Gospel of Matthew, the same story. He looked at the disciples, he said, "Why are you sleeping?" And he says, "Get up, let's go. Get up, let's go." In other words, he knew that the moment in time that history had been waiting for was now. And he got up with a purpose and he walked up to the cross. And he died on the cross and they laid him in a tomb and he waited for 3 days and God raised him from the dead. Can I tell you, that time of prayer, it gave him a sense of purpose to do what God had called him to do. And what I wonder is sometimes when I want to stop waiting and start hurrying, if the Lord is sometimes saying, "Hey, Clayton, I want to develop something in you in this time of prayer that you're going to need in the hour when the time has come." And today, because of his purpose and his mission, we're even talking about Easter the way we are today. Why? Because Jesus, of all people, got it right. Jesus had a purpose and a mission that he knew so well that nothing came in the way of it. And he was willing to go to any lengths to do what it would take for you to experience the miraculous work of God in your life today. He waited on that miracle so that you could have yours, so that you could spend eternity with him, so that today you have someone to go to in your hour of need. So I don't know what it is for you in this season, but as we jump into this season that I was going to believe is a season that's fruitful for this church, is maybe it starts for you this morning of saying, "God, I believe you can move and work in my life today. I'm standing at the top of the cliff and I'm looking down wondering what I'm going to do. Am I going to let fear hold me back? Am I going to let unbelief hold me back? Am I going to let the bad experiences I've had hold me back? Am I going to let what people around me are doing determine whether or not I jump? Or am I going to make the own decision in my heart today that, God, I believe you are who you say you are and you can do what you say you can do?"